Welcome to the podcast series of Tales from my Stethoscope. We'll be hearing true life stories. Some harrowing, some will have trigger warnings. A lot of them will be fairly humorous. We find out from the people who are on the forefront of rescue, the paramedics, the ER doctors, and the ER trauma nurses. These are their stories. Welcome to Tales from my Stethoscope. Can you imagine what it is that paramedics and doctors and nurses are exposed to? You know, who looks after them? And this podcast series is to honor them, to share their stories, to give them a place where they are able to speak freely, a place where they can share the stories that change their lives, the funny moments, the interesting moments, what they learned, how they shared their information and insight on great life-saving technique with each other. Often they don't get to tell their stories, and often those who've received the care of these people never get to know the people who were there in their moment where they needed help, where they needed someone to calm them, where they needed someone to save their lives. This is a place for not only paramedics, nurses and doctors, but for those of us who have been patients in our lives, a moment where we can pay tribute to the real heroes. A place of safety. My name is Ingrid von Stein, and I'll be narrating the series. Verwoerd, McMahon, and Klipdrift. You're going to wonder why these three words are so strange and in the middle of nowhere, but in order to tell paramedic story, we have to go back in time. So here we are, it's September 1964. Two young ambulance drivers, and I have to call them ambulance drivers because that's what they were. They had basic first aid training, and that was all they had. So two young ambulance men were on duty in Parliament, and President Verwoerd was addressing Parliament. And from the floor, someone got up, rushed up to him and stabbed him, once in the neck, 3 times in the chest. He died on scene, and the young ambulance man who was there tried his best with the little knowledge that he did have to try and save his life. And that which set him on a journey for the rest of his life. His name was Joseph von Stein. Some called him Podge, some called him Prof, some called him Doc Einstein. From that day onwards, he went on a quest because he knew there had to be a better way to do this. Had he had better training, if he had equipment, had he had medication, he would have been able, possibly, to save his life. So then we fast forward to 1975. And believe it or not, the first set of Jaws of Life arrived in South Africa at the Milnerton Fire Department in the Western Cape. This was the first time this piece of equipment had been brought into the country, and the fire chief at that stage was quite progressive. And he knew that with this equipment, he could extract someone from a vehicle in 10 minutes as opposed to an hour. Somewhere else at the same time was a young medical doctor. His name was Alan McMahon. And somehow, I'm never quite sure how their paths actually crossed. I have maybe theories, because the one thing I knew about Joseph and his friendship with Alan was they did enjoy a tipple every now and then. So I have no doubt that they may have either met at medical school or at a medical convention. Oh, who knows, even at the fire station. You might ask, who am I? I'm the daughter of Joseph von Stein. And these two men started working together. Alan McMahon was an absolute maverick in terms of emergency medicine, and he knew that there had to be a better way to do it. Vehicles had to be better equipped, staff had to be better trained, and he was the big ideas man. But in order to have those big ideas, you needed someone who can implement it. And so started a lifelong friendship between Joseph and Alan, who at the Cape Town Ambulance Services, which is based in Pinelands. It may be called something else now. And obviously I'm going to recall the story from the memories of a child. And I remember many, many conversations between these two men who were so animated, often over a bottle of Klipdrift, about how they were going to change things. So firstly, they were going to get better equipment. And in order to get better equipment, someone had to lobby because you needed a budget for that. And Alan had a natural ability to do that, while Joseph was more the practical, the implementer, putting the systems in place, making sure that everything worked logically. So if they were going to start training people, well, what were they going to start with? You know, so they started with the basics. Let's choose a few people and we'll put them through a training course, and we literally will build this training course as we go along. So they selected a group of guys from, they were then called ambulance men, and believe it or not, in the mornings or in the evenings before shift, they would stand parade, and the most senior officer on duty would actually go along and greet them all and check their uniforms. There was pride in what they did. They looked good. They were smart. They would say a prayer and they would go out onto the roads. Many of the issues that paramedics are dealing with today are still the same issues they dealt with at that time. Gang violence, senseless violence, drugs, alcohol. While so much has changed, nothing has changed. But I digress from the story. So Alan McMahon said, you know what? We're going to be able to do these amazing rescues. And Joe said, well, that's great. How are we going to do it? So firstly, after they had handpicked a few guys, they took them out of their uniforms and they put them in jeans, which was a big radical thing. Now imagine this. We now in the late 1975, put them in jeans and hard-topped boots, toed boots. And they said, right, this is going to be our uniform. And that was great when they thought, well, how are we going to actually be able to do all these things? You know, they were quite unfit. Many of these officers smoked and drank. And that's another story. I mean, the one thing that lacked in those days, and in many cases still does today, is debriefing and proper therapies. I mean, these people, men and women, are sacrificing their own well-being and just pushing trauma down and down, and there are layers upon layers of trauma. They're exposed to the worst of humanity. They see the worst things possible. So Joseph and Alan started training these people. So they started off with basic fitness, and now they were going to run. And as a little child, it was quite entertaining to watch them because, you know, my father would walk to the end of the driveway and be tired. Basic fitness, and started getting fit. And then they said, well, you know, we want to go up mountains. Alan was a big thinker. We want to go up mountains. And it was like, well, okay, we're going to go up mountains, but how are we going to rescue people? So they started doing training in terms of being able to abseil, being able to navigate up and down mountains, to be able to move patients. What sort of equipment did you need? Did we have the equipment in this country? No, we didn't have it. Let's try and source it from somewhere else. Joseph was, I think, always wanted to be an inventor, and often when they couldn't find a piece of equipment, he would MacGyver something and create a piece of equipment, whether it was a splint for a leg, or just laying out the actual vehicles better, putting in shelves, putting in cubicles, labeling everything. Then they started looking and talking to more and more people, and they said, you know what, we've got the police, we've got the ambulance service, we've got the flying squad, but none of us are all in a central place. So they moved out to, in the northern suburbs, they set up a central hub, and all the controls were going through one control room, so that the police and the ambulance service was starting to work together. And this hadn't happened before. And so the Metro Rescue Unit was born. Now, many people listening to this will remember them, because they were really the first in this country to be able to start to organize and to develop systems. They were both pivotal in the triage system of the different codings that we use today. At that stage, there was no formal training, so Joseph wrote the curriculum and put together the training programs and hosted and facilitated at their training school here in the Western Cape people from all over South Africa who who started receiving training. So there was a basic, I think they were called AMAs, no, EMAs, emergency medical assistants, and then a slightly higher level, which was called emergency medical technicians. At that stage, there was no drugs in the vehicle. I mean, they couldn't manage pain. So training had to happen on and not only training, but also to get these guys qualified so that they could administer basic drugs. Alan McMahon was the head of the squad from the medical perspective, and they would go out on all these calls, and they slowly changed the system. And one of the stories that I remember as a child, my father was immensely proud of the systems that he put in place and the training. And I've watched how young men and women who went through his training, who have flourished today in the world of, and are highly acclaimed paramedics. Many went on, actually after that, to go to medical school. Joseph was always a great one to have at medical school. He would the lecture halls would be packed out because he had a wonderful sense of humor and explained things quite simply. And these two men, Joseph and Alan, were almost like gods, although they never had an ego about it, knew how to stabilize a patient and transporting them from the scene of the accident or the trauma or whatever it was they were going through and getting them safely, securely and stable to the hospital. That whole thing that we today call a golden hour didn't exist in this country until these two amazing men started working together. But I digress a little. I remember my father being incredibly proud of the student that he had. And he talked about him endlessly. And I remember him saying to my mother, the strangest thing is this guy can hardly read or write, but he knows more about the human anatomy and emergency medicine than most qualified doctors do. He said, but how am I going to get him to do this exam? He can't write the exam. And he made an exception, and he was brought before a panel, and they gave him questions, and this young trainee answered everything. He did his practicals. He had a phenomenal memory. And through this process, my dad mentored him and helped him to be able to read better and to write better. So eventually he could do final exams, but his initial exams were all done orally. And my father was immensely proud of him because I think he achieved well into the 90s, and this just from being able to, he listened and he applied the knowledge that he had, and he watched. And I'll never forget, my dad often used to say, there's nothing magical about being a doctor. Medicine is only 10%. Listening to the patient, listening to the patient's body is 90%. And that's something that I've always remembered, but often see that people rush things. And I understand that being on accident scenes are difficult. So I thought I would start this podcast series just by giving you a little bit of understanding as to why you'll hear my voice and why I'm doing this. I don't know all the answers. I certainly don't. But I grew up as the child of a man who gave his entire life to make sure that patients were cared for, that they were stabilized, that they would get to the hospital and still be alive. A man who had incredible empathy and was organized and meticulous and could figure out what was going on by just listening to the person or listening to their body, just taking that quiet moment in all that chaos to be able to assess and evaluate what was going on. But at the same time, one of the things that has not changed is paramedics are exposed to incredible trauma, rape, family killings, violence, stabbing, shootings, and it's constant. And many succumb to either alcohol or drug addiction, or take their own lives. And I know this is quite an alarming thing to be saying, but if you actually went back and you delved in, you will see this ongoing pattern is what is in place. Yes, we can train them. They can be amazing medical people and be able to perform. But what happens when they are not there? Who is there when they're having these terrible, terrible nightmares? And I speak of this from a point of actually understanding. My father was amazing. He was revered. He was the hero to millions and millions of people. He saved so many lives. But when he wasn't on duty, he drank. He drank terribly. And it wasn't unlike him to finish a bottle of Klipdrift in a day. And a side of him came out, a man who was angry. And unfortunately, I was the point of his anger. And that was really unfair. And unfortunately, we didn't have the greatest relationship. But it took many, many years after he stopped drinking to be able to actually express what he was going through and what he had felt and what he had seen in his lifetime. I can only imagine, as a child, if I was driving in the car with my dad and there was an accident, he would always stop. It didn't make any difference whether he was on duty or not on duty. He was always on duty. He swore and he took an oath that he would be there for people in the time of need, and he would do the best that he could to stabilize them, to save their lives, and to get them safely to hospital. But I remember it was a Sunday morning. It was early on a Sunday morning, and my dad and I had taken a drive through to town because it was a little family ritual. We would get freshly made cook sisters from Auntie Lemise, I think her name was. And we were coming down Adley Street, and there was an accident just round the fountain towards the end of Adley Street, near the waterfront that is there today. And the victim was trapped in the car, and the car was on fire. And I remember my dad running, getting out the car. He didn't have any equipment on him, and how he struggled and tried time and time again to get that person out of the car. And eventually he couldn't do it. And it took a while for emergency services to come onto the scene. But at that stage, the person had already demised. And I remember the smell of burning flesh. And today I'm in my mid-50s. And many a night I relive that nightmare. And that was just one incident. So can you imagine what it is that paramedics and doctors and nurses are exposed to? Who looks after them? And this podcast series is to honor them, to share their stories.